Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. In a week of big headlines, presidential pardons generated quite a bit of national discourse. In a last-minute move before leaving office, President Joe Biden preemptively pardoned close family members. Then President Donald Trump, almost immediately after taking office, pardoned convicts from the January 6th attack on the Capitol, including individuals who assaulted police officers and others convicted of plotting to overthrow the government. These actions from both presidents prompted outrage across the political spectrum, but the nature of presidential power means what they did could become the new normal. Here this morning to discuss, we have experts with both legal and political experience. State Representative Robert Lynn, a former New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice, and also Paul Hodes, a former congressman and longtime attorney in the Granite State. Gentlemen, thank you for coming in and sharing your expertise with us today.
Sure, glad to be here.
Thank you. Judge/Representative Lynn, let's start with you. Obviously, a lot of the outrage could break down along partisan lines here. We heard from Governor Kelly Ayotte. She said she disagrees with what both presidents did in terms of the pardon power. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I, as a general proposition, I tend to agree with her. I think I probably have more problem with the Biden pardons than with the Trump ones, but I disagree with some of the Trump ones also.
What are the merits, though? Why do you disagree?
Well, in other words, I think that to the extent that people engaged in violence, and I think that you have to really look at the specifics of exactly what are you talking about for violence. But to the extent that someone engaged in significant violence, I would say that a pardon for that person would be something, you know, that I would think would be not a good idea. Now, a commutation, that's something else. Just as an example, my understanding is that one of the people that was convicted of quote-unquote seditious conspiracy got 22 years. That seems to me that really is, for what happened on January 6th, you know, personally, the idea that this was a seditious conspiracy just is beyond the pale. I don't think it was. I think it was, these were people who went to a protest and some got out of hand and rioted. And the people who rioted and committed violence, I don't have any problem with their being convicted and punished. But 22 years, that just seems to me, I mean, I was mentioning to Paul that, you know, I've actually had, when I was a judge, I had murder cases where it wasn't often, but there were murder cases where I didn't sentence somebody to 22 years if there were, you know, mitigating circumstances. And it just doesn't seem to me that somebody involved in January 6th deserved a sentence of 22 years.
Congressman Hodes, what's your perspective? And also, do you think there was a precedent set this last week by both presidents?
Well, look, presidential pardons are in the Constitution. There's been an escalation in the numbers of presidential pardons given out. Donald Trump has certainly set a record for the number of pardons given out, but I have a very different perspective about this. If we step back for a slightly larger view, I'm looking at a person who's now been elected to the presidency, who's a convicted felon, who engaged in a conspiracy to overturn an election based on the big lie that he promulgated, that the election was stolen, which it wasn't. He incited a mob to sack the United States Capitol to stop the peaceful transition of power. He conspired with others, and the mob that sacked the Capitol was a seditious, insurrectionist mob. Nothing like that has ever happened in our history. The Capitol of the United States, in which I served proudly, I served New Hampshire for a number of years, is a sacred place. It is sacred in our democracy. It is the place where democracy lives. And to see a mob leave behind blood, feces, and damaged police officers, they attacked police officers without regard to life or liberty, and those police officers have suffered grievous harm. For the president to pardon those people, to pardon that mob, is beyond the pale. It's ugly, it's shameful, it's an insult to our Constitution, and it's an insult to the American people.
Your perspective on that is clear. The Biden pardons, though, you know, some would argue that he was doing this to protect them from prosecution by President Trump's administration. One can understand the impulse to protect family, but doesn't the presidency demand a higher level of restraint to not do something like that?
We're in a completely uncharted territory. The way Donald Trump operates is he's out for a personal vendetta. He is out to take revenge and retribution. He's the leader of a cult, especially. In this circumstance, while I generally agree that I think it's important for presidents to be restrained in the use of the pardon power, I generally agree. In this unusual circumstance, I'm glad President Biden did what he did, because just recently, President Trump has even threatened and implied that President Biden should have pardoned himself because the president, Donald Trump, may want to go after him. This is unprecedented, uncharted territory in our history, and so both sidesism here just doesn't cut it.
Judge Lynn, I'll give you a chance to respond there.
Yeah, so, I guess I would say with respect to my colleague here, his view of this is not the view of the American people, because all of this lawfare stuff, including the conviction of the crime, so to speak, in New York, the American people knew about this. And in fact, and with regard to the pardons, the president, unlike former President Biden, the president indicated during the campaign what he intended to do with regard to the January 6th. And so the public knew about it, and the public voted for Donald Trump. They saw through this whole thing about, this was a seditious conspiracy. They were going to try to overthrow the government. That's all theater. That was all theater. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting that I condone violence or that the people that committed violence on January 6th should not have been punished. I think that they should have been. All I'm saying is that it was many of the people didn't commit violence, and those were many of the people that the president pardoned. But even the ones that did, in many cases, instead of pardoning them, he commuted the sentences for which I think were excessive for the reasons I stated before. And with regard to former President Biden, it's very clear that the Biden family had this sort of business of trading off the Biden name and the Biden position, particularly as vice president, and it's just very clear from the evidence that he was trading off that himself. He was allowing and encouraging his family members, particularly his son, but other family members, his brother, to trade off that. And so when he pardoned all those people, it seems to me that one of the things that he had to be going through his mind is, I'm helping out myself, because they're not going to have to worry that they'll be prosecuted and the government will somehow, try to get them to turn on me.
Judge Lynn, are you not concerned a little bit, though, at least in regards to the January 6th pardons, that those who were pardoned could now be incentivized to commit further political violence, knowing that the president will have their back?
I don't think so. I don't think that, I mean, again, if there were people that were pardoned that actually committed significant violence, and I'm talking about not, more than you punch somebody in the nose, but committed significant violence, then I don't think that those people should be pardoned. And to the extent that he did, I disagree with President Trump on that.
Congressman, just to broaden this conversation, absolute immunity. The Supreme Court of the United States has now ruled that the president, as long as he or she is acting in an official capacity, there is almost no act that is beyond the pale. What does that mean as we move forward, not just with the Trump presidency, but the future of the country?
Look, I take cold comfort in the fact that the American people were more worried about the price of eggs than they were about our democracy. This president has undermined the rule of law. The Supreme Court has given him immunity for any criminal act he may perform in his, quote, official capacity. That's a bad decision. It's bad precedent. It makes bad law, and it's bad for the country. What this president has done, for example, is he gave a pardon to a child pornographer who attacked Officer Sicknick at the Capitol, causing Officer Sicknick to suffer a series of strokes and die the next day. Yesterday on television, Officer Fanone talked about how scared he was about what the people who were pardoned may do to come after him and his family. And members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are already in cyberspace talking about guns, revolution, and what they intend intend to do. So this is dangerous. The president has released onto the streets dangerous people. And to somehow excuse that is just insufferable to me. My outrage knows no bounds. This president is reported to have said, and I'll be careful with my language, when faced with the prospect of trying to decide who deserves pardons, who doesn't deserve pardons, who was violent, who wasn't, F it, I'll just pardon them all. This is a president who cares only about himself. He doesn't care about the country. He doesn't care about the Constitution. And he doesn't care about the rule of law. We have always been a nation of laws, not of men. This would-be authoritarian is damaging the very fabric and foundation of our democracy, and we shouldn't stand for it.
Judge Lynn, what are your thoughts on absolute immunity? I know that from my brief time studying constitutional law, they talk about the penumbra of the Constitution starting to take the shape of a crown in some ways, setting aside the current president, the former president. This is a lot of power for one individual.
Sure. You know, I think, first of all, the court didn't say, you know, that anything a president does, he's immune from. It was limited to
official acts.
Official acts. And I think it's really important to understand that this was building upon, it's not like the court had never dealt with this issue before. Back in the 70s, it had dealt with the issue regarding civil immunity. And so this was an extension of that established precedent to the criminal law context. So I don't think it was, a huge step.
All right. Well, very interesting conversation. Judge Lynn, Congressman Hodes, Representative Lynn as well. You had many titles, so we appreciate your time on Closed today. Thanks so much. And we'll be right back with a discussion of legislation that scrambles all of the partisan lines in the State House and deals with very sensitive end-of-life issues. Stay with us.